South Africa is one of the most iconic nations on the planet, representing some of the best and worst humanity has to offer. But unfortunately, like much of Africa, it tends to be left out of geopolitical discussions. Given the fact that many African economies are rising rapidly, and South Africa is the second largest economy on the continent, I believe it's worth talking about, and we'll assess whether or not it could become a great power. Overall, the only nations on the African continent that rival South Africa in terms of power projections are Nigeria and Egypt, both of which are a transatlantic flight distance away. The country is blessed geographically, bordering both the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, the only nation to do so. This makes South Africa a serious contender in maritime affairs, as its seaports connect the interior of Africa with the rest of the world. The northeast of the nation is rather lush and makes for prime real estate. Well, not so much real estate, but perhaps farming. This makes South Africa an agricultural powerhouse. Further westward, you see the savannas in the interior, which are home to a spectacular array of wildlife. This is also home to the country's largest city, Johannesburg, which is the main business and financial center, arguably the most important on the entire continent, as well as a multicultural center of much of the country, and to a lesser extent to the world. Further inland lies a crater which holds much of the country's mineral wealth, providing the most important sector of its economy. Further westward lies a far more arid landscape that is primarily composed of deserts. It is also home to the oldest human culture, the Xhosa people. Along the coastlines, you get a Mediterranean climate, which makes it excellent for vineyards and other agricultural goods, and a supreme place for human habitation, as well as for seaports. Before we move on to the present power dynamics, let's briefly go over the country's history, as you can't really understand the present, let alone the future, without understanding the past. The first inhabitants of South Africa before recorded history were the Xhosa people. I'm terrible at pronouncing their names. They're also known for their clicky noises, and by and large are very similar to the first modern human beings. These original inhabitants were later subjugated under the Bantu migration. Various people groups from West Africa eventually poured into southern Africa, and they had agriculture and iron tools and weapons, which made them far more formidable. Eventually, you saw Phoenician exploration and later, far later, Portuguese exploration, but it wasn't until the Dutch when the real historical records came into prominence. Many farmers from the Netherlands, as well as Germany and France, eventually settled in South Africa, oftentimes coming into clashes with the native inhabitants. This would set up the foundation of the Afrikaner culture. However, eventually the British arrived looking for gold and diamonds. As the Boers, who were the people of Dutch and German descent, continued to move inland, they would come into more and more conflict with many of the Africans and the British. They would eventually set up two Afrikaner states. Before all of this happened, a man by the name of Shaka, leader of the Zulus, had conquered much of the eastern portions of what are now South Africa and parts of Mozambique. In spite of their backward technology, the Zulus would gain the military know-how to be formidable warriors, eventually defeating the British in one battle. The British eventually overtook the Zulus along with other African peoples, and managed to subjugate the Boers as well. So you basically had one group of European peoples taking land from another group of European peoples, who had taken land from a group of indigenous peoples, who also took land from another group of indigenous peoples. Hey, Quebec, sound familiar? South Africa also experienced a mining boom. This led to a great diversity of people working together, but it was also a time where you saw a great deal of racial resentment crop up on the institutional levels. Nonetheless, South Africa did help Mother Britain in both world wars. But after World War II, the Afrikaners in power eventually instituted the deeply racist apartheid system. Apartheid means separation, which gave second-class or really third-class citizenship to various people groups, namely people of African descent and to a lesser extent people of mixed African descent. The government crushed peaceful protesters, subjugated the press and free speech, and eventually locked up dissidents like Nelson Mandela. This led to a boycott, sanctions, and disinvestments from the international community. South African government eventually doubled down, even developing nuclear weapons to defend itself against the international community's hostility. Nonetheless, it had some tacit support from the UK and to a far lesser extent the US, who were at least sympathetic to their anti-communist stance. Nonetheless, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many Western governments stopped their toleration for the apartheid system. The last leader, W.F. de Klerk, reluctantly ended the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela was freed and would eventually become the first black head of state of the nation. Nelson Mandela was initially a Marxist growing up, or at the very least had Marxist sympathies throughout his youth, but he ran the country with a fairly pro-business mindset, similar to many of the neoliberals like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair at the time. Now let's move on to the economy of South Africa. South Africa has the third largest economy on the continent after Nigeria and Egypt, despite having a far smaller population than both of them. At one point, South Africa's economy made up 2/3 of the continental economy south of the Sahara. But the rapid growth of the economic powerhouses of Nigeria and Kenya made this no longer the case. This means that South Africa's power on the continent is probably going to decline relatively, as Ethiopia, Nigeria, and others rise in their power projections. There's also the possibility that some in East Africa will unite under an East African Commonwealth or Alliance or Federation. If that does happen, South Africa's days of being a major economic powerhouse on the continent are going to come to a relative close. However, that's not to say it will lose power or be irrelevant. South Africa has a relatively large population and large landmass. It is extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources, especially mineral wealth. South Africa, to this day, is one of the biggest exporters of gold and diamonds. The astonishing wealth that the mines provide for the country is pretty spectacular. On top of that, South Africa is an agro power, predominantly through the use of its vineyards and horticulture. It also has a very large tourism sector, primarily in the form of ecotourism. Now, unlike most African countries, South Africa is not too reliant on mineral wealth, raw materials, and agriculture. Namely, the main reason is that Johannesburg, for example, as stated before, is a major business and economic hub, as well as a financial center for banks. South Africa's relative isolation means it can also grow without threatening a lot of major powers on the world stage. The GDP per capita in South Africa is substantially higher than that of other African nations. However, this is by averages. While the country does have a sizable middle class, it is among the most unequal countries in the world, if not the most unequal, with a horrendous Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a quantitative metric to measure inequality in a country, and South Africa oftentimes ranks dead last. You have a white economic elite that run much of the business and commerce, and a black political elite that run, well, the politics. This is up against a vast underclass of predominantly black people and colored people who live with poor infrastructure, poor healthcare, and widespread unemployment. South Africa has tried to mitigate some of this problem through the use of a decentralized government, splitting up the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of each government into 3 different capitals. This country also has a very progressive constitution that not only allows for equal rights when it comes to free speech and due process, but also for affordable housing, affordable infrastructure, education, healthcare, and access to information. However, in practice, this just isn't oftentimes the case. The African National Congress, or ANC, has dominated South African politics since the end of apartheid. Now, while it played a very pivotal role in defeating apartheid, it has been involved in numerous corruption scandals and has been accused of political ineptitude. Its popularity has waned drastically, which has left a bit of an opening for other parties. Many South Africans feel as though the oppressive white ruling class has been replaced by a corrupt black ruling class, which cares little for the needs and concerns of ordinary South Africans. It doesn't help that many of the ghosts of the apartheid system have not completely passed. Not just between black and white, but also between Bantu-speaking people groups and the Xhosa people groups, along with a large Asian population, which is predominantly Indian, and a mixed population known as the colors, or coloreds. There is quite a lot of tension, and the healing still has a long way to go. The white population, by and large, lives a lifestyle that is fairly conducive to what you'd see in North America or Western Europe. However, the black population, outside of a few elites, by and large still lives in huts made out of corrugated iron. On top of that, this is fueled, but also fuels, a staggering crime rate. South African cities are among some of the most dangerous on the planet. This has led to more stratification, as rich communities live in gated compounds with security, and there's also been a great deal of brain drain, as the more educated people leave the countries to other parts of the world. This has become even worse when you have to deal with an AIDS epidemic that has hit South Africa particularly hard. Now, I hope I don't sound like I'm just ragging on South Africa. There's also a lot to admire. After all, this is a nation that ended apartheid peacefully. However, the transition has sometimes been rocky. So I'm going to move on to military affairs. The collapse of apartheid, while justified, led to a bit of a logistical nightmare for the military as political power shifted. This led to a great deal of administrative and bureaucratic complexity and a readjustment and reorganization of how the military operated. And it wasn't until the mid-2000s when the military was truly integrated fully into the new system. To this day, they are fairly under-equipped, but that might not be too much of an issue since the country doesn't border any particularly hostile, powerful countries. There aren't any countries that really want to go out of their way to conquer South Africa and steal its territory. And South Africa doesn't really have any imperial ambitions of their own. The countries that border South Africa, like Botswana, Mozambique, and Namibia, all tend to get along fairly well with South Africa. And on top of that, they're also fairly weak compared to South Africa, so they don't pose any significant threat. Overall, South Africa gets pretty well with the rest of the African continent, aside with a few spats with Zimbabwe. It's also a member of the African Union and continues to be the main regional power of Southern Africa. Given its geographic isolation in relative terms and weak neighbors, it has fairly cordial relationships with the vast majority of countries on the continent and the world. South Africa really isn't shaking its boots at the thought of anyone invading them. South Africa is also a member of the BRICS countries, composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This term was thought up by a Goldman Sachs member who wanted to invest in the developing world. It has kind of moved on to being a symbol of countries wanting to challenge Western hegemony. To what extent this is true is debatable. For example, China and India are members of BRICS and they tend to despise each other. South Africa, on the other hand, gets along with all of them, at least for the most part. But getting along with most people isn't enough to become a great power. On top of that, it needs to diversify its economy more so than it's already done. Gold and diamond exports are very important and have some prestige, but at the end of the day, they're unlikely to turn you into a scientific or technological powerhouse. On top of that, South Africa faces some of the greatest social and economic challenges of any of the large economies on the planet. I would probably say out of all the G20 economies, South Africa faces the hardest array of socioeconomic issues. But that doesn't mean that they're impossible to surpass. This is a country that managed to escape apartheid peacefully, in sharp contrast to, say, its northern neighbor Zimbabwe. And its resilience shows a degree of fortitude. And for that reason, I think that South Africa has the potential to pull itself by its bootstraps and have a bright future. Thanks for watching.